Everybody, this is Craig Tanner for The Mindful Eye and the Daily Critique. Today's image was submitted by Flo, who's an intermediate photographer from New Jersey. There's so many different things that I wanted to say about this portrait that I've turned this into a two-part daily critique, so we'll come back and revisit this image tomorrow. Let me give you the metadata here. Flo shot this with a Nikon D300, a 24mm lens, so after the crop factor, the effective focal length is right around 40mm. Flo exposed the file wide open here on the aperture f2.8, and shutter speed was 1/160th of a second. We'll come back and talk about a little bit of that metadata during the critiques of the image during the two videos. And Flo gave us some backstory information here. This is her grandson. They were out to eat, and her grandson Connor was playing around with the roll-up that the silverware comes in, and he turned back around and she took this picture. And she said because he wasn't sort of paying attention to the camera, and she sort of caught him unaware here, she feels like she's captured a serious side of his personality. Flo said that there were really sort of two main challenges that she was facing here as a photographer. One was the background, that it was busy. She's already cropped in square to get rid of some things that she thought were creating too much busyness in the background, and also just the fact that there was mixed lighting and that she was getting some color cast. She's already processed the image in Photoshop CS3 RAW and then Nikon software, but still has some questions about color balance. We're going to get into the color balance issues tomorrow and talk about a couple of other things tomorrow. Today I want to talk about what I like about the portrait, and then I want to talk about the psychological impact of gesture today. I also want to talk about quality of light and maybe get into the idea of perspective via your lens choice. When I look at this image, to me, one of the things that I love about it is something that Flo has already mentioned, which is we're seeing a very serious gesture and expression, and we're seeing that on a child, and that tends to have a big psychological impact on the viewer. The other thing about gesture and expression is just the way that we perceive it changes dramatically based on how close the portrait photographer is to the portrait subject. Flo is sort of inside of what would be considered a socially safe distance, and so now as we view the portrait, just that has an effect on us. We get the sense that we're very, very close to this person. That's a confrontation right away. When you add to that the idea that Connor is looking right at us. When you look at this image, you look into his eyes, and it's almost a confrontation. He's just looking right at us. That has a big psychological impact in a couple of ways. One of the ways is just the idea of a confrontation when you look right at somebody. But the other way that it psychologically has an impact on us is that it reminds us of the photographer, and that sets a completely different tone. It would be cinematic if Connor was looking away, and in cinema, unless the filmmaker is trying to make a very dramatic point. Woody Allen's a good example of a filmmaker who started having the character, a lot of times it was him, turn and look into the camera and speak straight to the audience. But most of the time a director is going to flip out if the actor looks into the camera. It then breaks the magic spell, and we're no longer a fly on the wall, and it's much harder to suspend belief surrounding the story. And so those are two levels. There are lots of other levels psychologically of the difference between the portrait subject looking right into the lens and now potentially at the viewer, and then this whole idea of being reminded of the photographer, being reminded of there's a second person here. The other thing that's powerful here is just in story, the idea of opposites. We have an archetype that we think about with children, but then when we see a child looking this serious, that has a big impact. And the other thing is the head being straight up and down, and I cannot overemphasize this if you're just getting into portraiture. When the head is squared up and straight up and down so that the features of the face form parallel lines to the edge of the frame and the eyes are looking straight in, all of that combines to almost become a challenge from the portrait subject to the viewer. And even the slightest tilt of the head off of this axis, even if it's just a little bit, will start to suggest a softness and an opening where this is a challenge. And you can play around with this if a person is very nervous, and a lot of times if they are, they won't tilt their head. They'll naturally square up. They're threatened, and this is body language that we exhibit when we're maybe afraid or we're challenged or we're surprised. We can start to tilt the camera, and that might end up having an effect, or it might help to break this psychological feeling. I just really wanted to talk about those things today because, you know, when I think about portraiture, I think about sort of a list of things that are really important to me as a photographer. And the first one is light. And I group in with the idea of physical light, the quantity and quality of light that's reflecting off of my subjects. I add into that category gesture and expression. To me, that's a form of light energy, but now we're talking about sort of the energy that's coming from inside of a portrait subject and is being expressed through body language, gesture, and expression. I group all that together and I say to myself, this is sort of at the top of the list of the things that are important if I'm trying to manage things. And then just to give you the rest of the list real quick, I love color. So if I'm working in color, I actually a lot of times think about color next. And then camera position, very, very important. And a lot of times I'm trying to figure out ways to have a radical camera position. And this is a good example to me of a radical camera position simply because of how close flow is to the portrait subject. And then the other thing that I think about quite a bit is layers of story. We'll get into that a little bit more tomorrow. Let's talk about light. When I look at this image, another thing that I'm really enjoying is how much dimension there is in Connor's face. And light is playing a big part in that. You've got a highlight side of the face and a dark shadow side of the face. The difference between light and dark drives dimension. We have shadows that are flowing from this side of the face over to this side of the face. The other really interesting thing about light here is that there's some light in the eyes, but the fascinating thing about that light and about really the majority of the light, it looks like you have windows here, but then you have a very specular table and some very, very bright table place mats, and you've got some very bright plates. So to me it looks like the majority of this big light source is actually coming from down here. And that's doing two things that are very powerful in this image. Yes, there's a flow of light from right to left, and that drives dimension, but there's a little bit of a sense of some of the light coming from low to high, so that shadows start to either move straight across the face or slightly up. And that has a radically different psychological effect on the viewer than shadows that move down. You don't have to know anything about photography for this to happen to you, so something to really pay attention to. The sun is always going to make shadows that drop down on the face, because the sun is going to set, and once it sets, it's no longer the light source, but before it sets, it's up here above eye level. The kind of light over a long period of time that human beings have gotten used to that drives shadows up on the face is campfire light, lights at night, point sources of light in the dark when we're naturally more afraid. And we actually call this form of lighting monster lighting because of the monsters that we're afraid of at night. And so any movement of shadows up on the face is going to have a subconscious effect on the viewer. It does something else that's more sort of technical in nature. It has the potential to set catch lights in the eye in the bottom part of the eye and outside the pupil of the eye, and that can start to give a conflicted feeling to the viewer. We want to look into the pupil, but then we have this real bright highlight. High contrast really drives a lot of visual weight, and so we have the visual weight of this catch light, which is the corner of the table here. We have a little bit of the catch light of the window, which is much smaller, that's up here, and that's outside of the pupil. And so when we look in there, we're conflicted. I just want you to watch on this. This is just a layer I copied to pretend like I have a good workflow. Here's a layer where I got rid of some specular highlights like this and over here on the edge of the frame, but I also took those catch lights and I moved them back inside of the pupil and I softened them. And I just want you to see how much differently you feel about looking into Connor's face when the catch lights are outside of the pupil and they're in the lower part of the eye, when they're moved to something that's smaller and softer and is congruent with the inside of the pupil. Very, very, very different feeling. I cannot overemphasize this. It's one of the big takeaways from today's critique. Number one, getting light into the eyes, the direction of it. And the cool thing about catch lights is that if you get some light in the eyes, then you can manage the catch lights, and a lot of the times I do. I'll make the catch lights centered more in the eye. I'll get the catch lights up in the top part of the eye. I'll put them in a dynamic placement, so working with rule of thirds in the eye. And even the shape a lot of times will be determined by the overall feeling of shape in the image. Here it might be nice to have more rounded catch lights because we're seeing the whole mask of the face, the whole head, and there are circular ideas in the background of the image. So the circle is a very, very powerful bit of visual design here. Might be neat to have the catch lights to rhyme that. Even this marking here on Connor's face, there's so many different ideas of circle here, and so I just cannot overemphasize. Just look at this one more time. the power of placement of couch lights in the eye and the shape of couch lights. I think I'm probably at 10 minutes, so that's quite a bit for today. There's a lot more that we can talk about. We'll try to get to all of that in a 10-minute video tomorrow. Would love to hear your feedback about this part of the critique on this image. Tomorrow we'll come back, we'll talk about perspective, we'll talk about layers of story, and we'll talk about getting rid of some of the color cast in the image. Big thank you to Flo for sharing this very provocative and beautiful portrait of Connor with us, and hope to see you again soon, actually tomorrow, for part 2 on the Mindful Eyes Daily Critique.